Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. I want to talk about Black Lives Matter today in a slightly different way. I have come to the conclusion that the movement, aside from its political or conspiratorial origins, it is essentially psychological projection. We have all these people saying Black Lives Matter, whereas the evidence on the ground is that apparently they don't. I mean, in the sense that so many of them are murdered in the United States every year, and this 2020, the year of Black Lives Matter, or at least second time around for Black Lives Matter, I suppose, after that supporter killed 5 cops in Dallas. That didn't leave a very good odor, but now it's back and bigger and better than ever. Let's see. This is from Steve Saylor's blog. 64 shot, 10 dead, spike in gun violence, alarms, and on edge, New York City. The victims included a young father who was shot while holding hands with his 6-year-old daughter in the Bronx. And there is a tweet here from Chief Rodney Harrison of the New York Police Department detectives. On Sunday, July the 5th, police officers from the 44th Precinct responded to a 911 call for a male shot at Sheridan Avenue and East 170th Street. And we see the man with his daughter walking across the crosswalk. A car pulls up, a gun comes out. He is shot, he falls to the ground, and his daughter runs away. Earlier, we had an 8-year-old girl shot in her car with her mother and another person in Atlanta because they were violating the sovereignty of the sacred autonomous zone, which has grown up around the Wendy's that was burned to the ground after a man was dealt with by the police for being passed out in his car and blocking the drive-through lane. Later, after the cops were done with him, his girlfriend apparently burned down the Wendy's, and as I say, it's become a sacred spot. Let's see, New York City surpassed 400 shootings in the first half of the year for the first time since 2016, with 528 by the end of last month. The 205 shootings in June were the highest for that month since 1996. Other cities have seen similar spikes in shootings, most notably Chicago, where the current pace of homicides has the city poised to near its record high of 778 set in 2016. Chicago had 336 murders as of July the 2nd. New York, with nearly 3 times the population, had 181 at the end of June. I understand that the clearance rates for black shootings in Chicago is just over 20%. And why is that? Because snitches get stitches. Everybody know, but they're not talking to the authorities. And what this means is, as Jill Levy demonstrated in her book, A Ghetto Side, that in inner cities in the United States, everybody knows a murderer. Everybody's brother or son or father or cousin or uncle or whatever is a murderer, and they know it. But apparently this is something that the people in these places can live with. Now, Terry Crews, the actor who has been in the news a lot of late, spoke with Don Lemon at CNN, and he made Don Lemon angry. He said this: when you have the leaders of the Black Lives Movement who are now talking about, if we don't get our demands, we're going to burn it down, other black people who are talking about working with other whites and other races, they're being viewed as sellouts or called Uncle Toms. You start to understand you're now being controlled. You're not being treated as loved. You're actually being controlled. Someone wants to control the narrative. I viewed it as a very, very dangerous self-righteousness that was developing, that, that really viewed themselves as better. It was almost a supremacist move where they viewed that their Black lives mattered a lot more than mine. Yes, and Cruz had said last week that he was worried that Black Lives Matter was turning into Black Lives Better, which is clearly the case, despite, as I say, the facts on the ground. That many thousands of Black people in the United States every year are murdered, usually over trifles. And it is not unusual for Black people, for children, to be killed by stray bullets in the inner city. It is not unusual for people, sometimes children, to be killed when guns are brought to baptisms or birthday parties. Don Lemon said, "You think Black Lives Matter? You said you think it's an extreme movement." Cruz responded, "No, this is the thing. It's a great mantra. It's the true mantra. Black lives do matter, but when you're talking about an organization, you're talking about the leaders, you are talking about the people who are responsible for putting these things together." Lemon said, "Terry, you realize that even during the civil rights movement, that Dr. King was seen as extreme." He was not seen as extreme at the time of his death in 1968. In fact, he was seen as old hat, passé. The baton had been passed to the Black Power activists, Stokely Carmichael, Huey P. Newton, etc., etc. Anyway, let me continue. To people who don't want to make change, movements are seen as extreme. You can paint them easily as extreme when they are not. Cruz said, "When you look at the city of Chicago, there are 9 children who died by gun violence, by black on black gun violence from June the 20th all the way to today. You're talking about a month and you have 9 Black kids, and the Black Lives Matter movement has said nothing about this kind of thing." Lemon said, "What does that have to do with equality, though, Terry? I don't understand what that has to do with equality." Now, I know that Don Lemon is an exceedingly stupid person, but one would think that the right to life would be right up at the top of priorities in equality. Lemon said, "I lived in Chicago. There are many people who are working in those communities to try and get rid of the gun violence." I don't believe you, Mr. Lemon. The gun culture in this country is prevalent. You see, these guns take over. And they shoot people for their own agenda, apparently. But I don't understand what that has to do with a movement that's for equality for Black people. Again, he is unusually stupid. It's not mutually exclusive that if you care about equality for Black people, that somehow you're going to stop random violence or, unfortunately, kids from being shot. It just seems like apples and oranges. Cruz said, "It's not that way. This is the thing, Don. Black people need to hold other Black people accountable." Dangerous statement to make in 2020, or a dangerous statement to have made in the last 10 years or 20 years, for that matter. This is the Black America's version of the Me Too movement. If anything's going to change, we ourselves need to look at our own communities and look at each other and say this thing cannot go down. This is the thing, too. There are a lot of great, great people there who are held hostage by people who literally are running these neighborhoods with violence and then claiming that Black lives matter. Yeah, I could point out that a great many gang members are on the payroll on American cities. They are frequently married to people who are making decisions. I could also point out that there's this whole genre of music called hip hop or rap, which for the last, 40 years has been glamorizing shooters, glamorizing people who represent and kill people, typically over tribal beefs or even trifles. So in any event, Lemon continues, Black Lives Matter is not all encompassing. Well, the name would seem to suggest that it is. If someone started a movement that said cancer matters, and then someone comes and says, "Why aren't you talking about HIV?" It's not the same thing. We're talking about cancer. So the Black Lives Matter movement is about police brutality and injustice in that manner, not about what's happening in black neighborhoods. This comparison of HIV to cancer is an interesting one because that's exactly what we saw in the 1980s, because apparently AIDS lives matters. Now, AIDS is or HIV, is a sexually transmitted disease. It's something that is actually rather easy to curtail. But no, it was AIDS, 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 and all the other diseases were firmly in second place, or even further down the list. Lemon says, Black Lives Matter movement is about police brutality and injustice in that manner, not about what's happening in black neighborhoods. So Black Lives Matter, but not in black neighborhoods. That's clearly what Lemon is suggesting. And of course, Black Lives Matter is about a lot more than police brutality and injustice in that manner. We've been told in recent weeks that black people are the culture, that black people are the beauty, that black people built America, that black people need to be hired by every business at every level, that people should be replaced by black people in various jobs. So it's about a lot more than police brutality. Cruz says, but when you look up at the organization, police brutality is not the only thing they are talking about. And Don Lemon says, I know that. I agree. Gosh, he's dumb. But that's not what the Black Lives Matter movement is about, Terry. Black Lives Matter is about police brutality and about criminal justice. It's not about what happens in communities. When it comes to crime, black on black crime, apparently it has to do with white on black crime, which is exceedingly rare in the United States. People who live near each other, black people kill each other, same as whites. Yeah, but not to the same degree. Not to the same degree. And certainly not to the same numbers. 80% of white people are killed by white people because of proximity. Actually, when you remove all of the black murders in the United States from the statistics, there's not all that many murders left. Same thing with black people, Lemon continues. It happens in every single neighborhood. But again, I'm not saying it's not important that those kids died, but it's a different movement. Cruz said, I understand what you're saying. I totally understand. It's about police brutality. That should never be accepted. I'm not saying that that's not it, but there's more here. And when I look, if they have more on their agenda, we have to ask them about what else is on that agenda other than police brutality. And that's all I'm doing, questioning, warning, watching. And if that bothers you now, that bothers me. And Lemon is projecting. No, he does not want to talk about the grotesque conditions that obtain in black communities because it's embarrassing. And it suggests that to a great many people, black people in the inner cities, particularly those who, to a large extent, control these neighborhoods through gang activity or by looking the other way, that they just don't care that much. There's a story here by Douglas Rushkoff, how centuries of black strength have created a blueprint for economic recovery. Black communities have for centuries harbored a spirit of support and mutual aid. Is this guy kidding us? My idea of mutual aid does not include people murdering each other over trifles. But it's time the rest of the country followed their lead. This Rushkoff fellow, he's some sort of techno-futurist. He begins, there is no level of reparation that could ever make up for the devastating impact of white cruelty on African Americans. Oh, so if that's the case, why don't we just drop all this talk about reparations? But long before any such repair was even being floated in mainstream culture, black Americans were busy repairing things for themselves. Well, is this man obtuse? Or is he stupid? Or is he a liar? In fact, white oppression in America has always been matched by an even greater ingenuity and resilience from Black communities. The more Black people were shunned and segregated from the rest of the American society, the more they were forced to invent the kind of circular economic and local reinvestment strategies the rest of us are discovering only now. Well, apparently, circular economic local reinvestment strategies. Black people invented this. Apparently, white people have never engaged in that kind of behavior. The fact that Black lives are finally coming to matter in America, let's just ignore the last 60, 70 years of American history. Does not introduce some new encumbrance on anyone, while reparations would be a rather considerable encumbrance. In fact, already affirmative action, both official and unofficial, are rather substantial encumbrances on the majority of people in the United States. On the contrary, dating back to at least the 1700s, Black Americans developed and deployed robust approaches to mutual aid and cooperative economics. We can all learn from the Black experience right now as we look towards sustaining ourselves during lockdown and remaking our economy without the benefit of a functioning federal government. Whoa! So it's all over then? Is it? These stories have been hidden in many cases because economic success in Black communities inevitably leads to white jealousy. What on earth is he talking about? Which in turn inspires more oppression, pogroms, and murder. Who's doing the pogroms in America? Rushkoff. And because co-ops and mutual aid can sound downright communist to the uninformed, America's never had cooperatives. No, never had anything like that. It's never had credit unions or any of that stuff. Even many modern civil rights activists didn't want to be condemned as red on top of everything else. What color is the sky in Rushkoff's world? Honestly. Yes, and he talks about W.E.B. Du Bois, who died rather a long time ago. The Homestead Act, Mechanics and Farmers Bank and Insurance Company, established in 1907. Let's talk about Tulsa. Let's not get into the detail about what happened in Tulsa. And let's see. Even as recently as the 1960s, you mean when Black society in America essentially collapsed? You want to talk about that? You want to talk about the Great Society? You want to talk about the Talented Tenth or Marcus Garvey or indeed W.E.B. Du Bois? Are they popular figures in the Black community now? I don't think so. As Black Lives Matter makes abundantly clear, oppression has been a self-defeating strategy all along. What's he talking about? You notice there's no figures? No figures here? He says the rolling jubilee conceived by members of Occupy Wall Street has already bought and abolished over $34 million of student and medical debt for just pennies on the dollar. Occupy Wall Street was not a Black movement, so far as I remember. Let's just assert something to be true. And if you disagree with it being true, then that makes you a bad person and you've lost the argument and you should just shut up because Black Lives Matter. Now, on that note, there's an excellent piece in the tablet that appeared June 21st by Jacob Siegel. And it's called The New Truth. When the moral imperative trumps the rational evidence, there's no arguing. I've mentioned before Black Twitter. There's no point in getting engaged unless you're looking for laughs, because the same buzzwords, actually not exactly buzzwords so much as words being used as talismans. No justice, no peace. That argument is over, whatever the argument is. Siegel writes, the new mode is argument by commandment. It borrows the form to game the discourse of rational argumentation in order to issue moral commandments. No official doctrine yet exists for this syncretic belief system, but its features have been on display in all of the major debates over political morality of the past decade. Marrying the technical nomenclature of rational proof to the soaring eschatology of the sermon, it releases adherents from the normal bounds of reason. The arguer commander is animated by a vision of secular hell, unremitting racial oppression that never improves despite myths about progress, society as a ceaseless subjection to rape and sexual assault, Trump himself arriving to inaugurate a Luciferian reign of torture. Those in possession of this vision do not offer the possibility of redemption or transcendence. They come to deliver justice. In possession of justice, the arguer commander is free at any moment to throw off the cloak of reason and proclaim you a bigot, racist, sexist, transphobe who must be fired from your job and socially shunned. Practitioners of the new argument bolster their rationalist veneer with constant appeals to forms of authority that come in equal parts from biology and elite credentialing. Have you noticed how many people, especially online, start their statements by telling you their profession or their identity group? He gives an example. As a privileged white woman, as a doctoral student in applied linguistics, as a progressive Jewish BIPOC paleontologist, and so on. These are military salutes, which are used to establish rank between fellow as-us, while distinguishing them as a class from the civilian population. You must always listen to the experts. The new form of argument insists, and to the science. Anything else would be invalid science denialism, not rational, immoral. Because of the way it toggles back and forth between rationalism and religiosity, switching categories by taking recourse to one when the other is questioned. I'll just butt in to say that that's why Kingsley Amis advised never to argue with communists or with women. The new form of argument commandment, rather than invalidating itself or foundering on its own contradictions, becomes somehow rhetorically invincible through the demonstration of power relations that the arguer denies exists, but are plainly manifest in the progress of the argument. The group of historians who submitted their letter of dissent to the New York Times objecting to the historical claims in the paper's flagship 1619 project provided a nice demonstration of this point. They questioned the project's scholarship and in response were accused of being old white men, as indeed most of them were, and antique reactionaries. When they pleaded that they were not abettors of white supremacy but objected to the project's historical claims, they were told their history was in error. In the end, the historians, however distinguished their careers were beforehand, appeared confused and defeated, complaining solicitously in their allotted column inches in the paper's letters section. The 1619 project, meanwhile, having essentially conceded the historian's central point, lost nothing at all. It marches on unscathed toward becoming the official curriculum in the nation's public school system, replacing the products of the American historical profession as a whole, which must either adapt or suffer a similar humiliation. The outcome proved that whether or not the historians were right about the facts of history, they had made a fundamental error in judging where power lies. At best, they are dopes who thought they were smarter, which is to say more powerful than they are. At worst, they are professionally self-destructive and, who knows, maybe even racists. Argument itself requires that certain fundamental questions are settled and beyond dispute. In order to argue over whether the sky is blue, we'll have to agree on what the sky is. The new argumentation has not only vastly expanded the number of subjects that are supposed to be beyond argumentation, it has, by a sleight of hand, reversed the nature of the matters that cannot be questioned. Now, it is precisely the most contentious issues. Is biological sex a valid concept? Is racism and abuse so widespread in American law enforcement that we should immediately defund the police? That must be accepted a priori. And I'll just say here that we have all been bullied into accepting these terms racism, which is never defined, and systemic racism, which of course is never defined as well. There is no practical efficacy to these terms. Siegel continues to insist that the conclusion that the arguer wishes to reach with its implied corollary commandment must be accepted by his or her opponent as a premise before the argument begins is not the move of a person who has confidence in their truth. It is the opposite of any form of reasoned argument. It is coercive. Except the people who argue this way claim that they cannot possibly be coercive, because you must accept the premise that they don't have power, even if they are editing the New York Times Magazine or threatening to get you fired from your job. You say they can't have it both ways. They say, why not? And then accuse you of opposing the powerless, which it turns out is a form of authority that cannot be trumped. I've spoken of the cognitive dissonance of the left, and also of their use of the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, which they have internalized, and which is essentially their mode of expression. Something is so, unless you want to look at it from this point of view, when it's not so, but it doesn't matter, because no justice, no peace, or some such thing. And then he talks about some recent examples of this new kind of argument. The moral injunction is believe women, and if you believe women, don't you? The argument underlying the slogan is that sexual violence is rampant in America and goes unaddressed and unpunished because of the endemic misogyny in our society. There are rational assertions contained within this argument that claim that American women are the victims of rampant sexual violence enabled by ingrained cultural and legal biases, was advanced initially as a matter of social science, that is, as a matter of science, based on empirical evidence, such as a famous study that found 1 in 5 women on American college campuses had been sexually assaulted. If women were being victimized at such appalling rates and their assailants routinely going unpunished, it followed that they required protections greater than those which our current notions of legal and judicial fairness provided. And then he says, it turns out that the rational argument was wrong. The evidence did not actually show that 1 in 5 women would be sexually assaulted on a college campus, a statistic repeated by President Barack Obama himself to justify, quote, sweeping changes in national policy, unquote. It turns out that the author of the study himself acknowledged that it was based on surveying only 2 campuses, and the numbers could not be extrapolated to a national trend as the White House itself had done. Other studies, widely cited at the time to justify the construction of a punitive new Title IX sex bureaucracy, were also marred by significant methodological shortcomings. I'll point out that when we talk about sexual assault is a term which has replaced an older term in the law, rape. A sexual assault is such a broad term that, again, it has very little efficacy at all. And it was really rather a shocking proposition, I suppose, in the 1990s, when it was put forward, authoritatively, of course, that a woman attending a college who had had sexual intercourse with a man attending this college, and then a few days or a few weeks or a few months later, decided that she was gravely unhappy with having done so, was the victim of sexual assault. Siegel continues, if you were clueless enough to point out the flaws in rational claim X, even just to wonder over matters of degree, then wham, you were whacked in the face with moral claim Y. Except evidence X isn't evidence, it's window dressing. And if you're too stupid to understand that, then you're probably an even worse person than the arguer supposed. It is no surprise that the entire Me Too movement grew out of the revelations about Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, a loathsome man who was, by all accounts, a bullying asshole, a lecher, a tyrant, a sweaty, groping pig. But in the end, justice finally caught up to him, and Weinstein became the evil pig who launched a whole movement. And that was where most of us stopped thinking about it. But there were a few more twists in the story. First, there was Asia Argento, one of the first actresses to come forward with her story of sexual abuse at the hands of Weinstein, and one of the leaders and public faces of the Me Too movement, who turned out to be an accused sexual predator herself. No one should have to be a perfect victim or a moral exemplar to be given sympathy and believe, but Argento was pushing it. Then there was the evidence that came out in Weinstein's trial. One of his key accusers was a young aspiring actress with whom he had had a years-long relationship, just the kind of vulnerable victim that Weinstein was said to have sought out. But the private correspondence kept by this woman, which included both letters to Weinstein and letters to her boyfriend about the Hollywood producer, suggested something far more complicated than a predator-victim relationship of the kind that is criminally prosecutable. Especially revealing was the woman's claim that Weinstein's sexual organ was defunct, a detail that, if true, would present all sorts of complications for an alleged serial predator like Weinstein, or should have. I made this point before, but I'm going to make it again. I thought that the verdict in Weinstein's trial was a travesty. We don't need proof anymore. The fact that a woman says that it's true is sufficient for conviction. The fact that her story, or at least one of the major accusers, that her story did not stand up to scrutiny, well, you'd have to be a very bad person to point this out, wouldn't you? Siegel then talks about Black Lives Matter. He says it's a movement that makes its core doctrinal claim a value that no decent person can object to. It asserts that not merely formal legal acknowledgement, but full human dignity and consideration has been uniquely robbed from Black Americans throughout their country's history. No one with a basic knowledge of American history can deny that this claim is true. Again, when you say throughout America's history, well, by 1968, Black Americans had full civil rights. That is a fact. There's no denying it. But the statement Black Lives Matter makes also has a more pointed political meaning, which is that Black lives are systematically valued in the present and under assault from racist police violence and an overarching regime of white supremacy. Again, this term white supremacy, what does it mean? Nobody knows what white supremacy means. But this white supremacy supposedly animates every aspect of modern American life. That life, therefore, is in urgent need of reparative justice, like defunding the police and establishing formal and informal systems of preferences that this time prefer blacks over whites, that statues of white men must be pulled down, that corporations must fire their current employees and hire new employees based on their skin color, and that a massive program of public re-education must be set in motion across American society, and especially in public schools. Well, that's already happened. Golly. American school children surely know far more about Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman than they know about, John Adams or even Alexander Hamilton, let alone Benjamin Franklin. There may be no more totemically powerful moral claim in all of American life than those three words, Black Lives Matter. As a meme, it is invincible. But the moral claim, with its demand for immediate radical changes to policing and other institutions of American life, is not just a moral claim, it is also supposedly a reflection of observed and analyzed material conditions. For instance, that there is an epidemic of racist, or more correctly, anti-Black police violence in America. It does little good to point out that the majority of police violence in 2020 America is directed towards white people, or that a total of 14 unarmed Black men were in fact shot in America last year, while a greater number of unarmed light-skinned men were shot by the police, or that a majority of police officers protect their communities in a lawful manner under often difficult conditions. And since it doesn't matter if you can see that there is evidence of racial bias in policing, just not at anything like the catastrophic level that justifies calls to defund the police, and it doesn't matter whether you acknowledge a significant need for police reform to make it less prone to escalating violence and more accountable, since that hardly seems to matter in the context of a discussion that now centers on police abolition. Why would anyone go to the trouble? The paradigmatic case of police violence in the modern era was the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. It was Brown's death shortly after Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida that consolidated the movement's power in national politics. The motto born of the killing that gave birth to the modern era of race relations was "Hands up, don't shoot." Only we know now that this phrase, a shorthand for the evidence that indicts the society and justifies its rejection and refounding, did not describe the reality of Brown's death. A lengthy investigation of the killing by the Obama Justice Department found that Brown did not have his hands up and may have been charging at Wilson when he was killed. Again, it doesn't matter. The police execution of Michael Brown, who was shot with his hands up, proved supposedly the rational basis for the moral claim that Black Lives Matter with its implied set of commandments. The organs of reason and expertise have one by one pledged their cultish loyalty to this new faith. A group of doctors wrote an article in Scientific American explaining why mentioning or reading of the results of George Floyd's autopsy was a racist act. Public health officials across the country who had in May condemned public demonstrations in the strongest terms now fully endorse the protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd. In a petition signed by some 1,200 health officials, they declare it is incumbent on others in the profession to offer unwavering support to the current protesters as a matter of both moral and medical hygiene. They altogether elide the difference between empirical claim and moral commandment by declaring that, quote, white supremacy is a lethal public health issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19. And so the merger of pseudo-rationalist discourse with the new American religion of anti-racism is completed. What we are witnessing in the rapidly transforming norms around race, sex, and gender is not an argument at all, but a revolution in moral sentiment. In all revolutions, the new thing struggling to be born makes use of the old system in order to overthrow it. At present, institutions like the university, the press, and the medical profession preserve the appearance of reason, empiricism, and argument while altering, through edict and coercion, the meaning of essential terms in the moral lexicon like fairness, equality, friendship, and love. That the effort wins so much support speaks to the deep contradictions and corruption of American meritocratic institutions and of the liberal individualist moral regime it seeks to replace. Moral revolutions cannot tolerate ambiguity, but there is so much that I'm not sure of. How does one argue with this new form of truth? Not in the old way, not by taking the bait. Well, yeah, I would suggest that there's no point in arguing with it because one is wasting one's time arguing with irrational or crazy people, and this is a form of craziness. In fact, you may have noticed in recent years, we have heard from Black scientists that Western norms in science, such as empiricism, are, wait for it, racist. Now, the academy. What good is the academy? That's a serious question. It produces certificates that people need to get jobs. They didn't used to need such certificates. But it was only when the Supreme Court of the United States banned the use of IQ tests in employment that you had to have a certificate. But these certificates are very expensive and they do not guarantee employment. Or how would I say, remunerative employment. They also, the academy poisons the people who attend it. Of course, not just in the United States, but in my country of Canada as well. I recently became aware of a writer, an Inuit or Inuk writer called Norma Dunning, who was complaining that it was only white people's greed that explained why the Canadian Football League has a team called the Edmonton Eskimos. Greed, white people's greed. In any event, this woman has recently become a highly praised author in Canada. She writes short stories. People stopped reading short stories decades ago, but we're informed this woman is a major author. And the University of Alberta Press explains her thus. Norma Dunning is an Inuit writer, scholar, researcher, and grandmother who grew up experiencing a silenced form of indigeneity in the southern areas of Canada. A silenced form of indigeneity. Who's silencing her? How is she silenced? This is the kind of people go to universities and they come out of universities deranged and composing sentences such as that. Now, we know that the claims made by Black Lives Matter about, basically that white cops, and I suppose black cops and Asian cops who are essentially white because of the nature of the institution, that they go around, or that their main activity is finding black people to torture and kill. We know that this isn't true. This is from Retraction Watch. The authors of a controversial paper on race and police shootings say they are retracting the article, which became a flashpoint in the debate over killings by police and now amid protests following the murder of George Floyd. The 2019 article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, titled Officer Characteristics and Racial Disparities in Fatal Officer-Involved Shootings, found no evidence of anti-Black or anti-Hispanic disparities across shootings, and white officers are not more likely to shoot minority civilians than non-white officers. And this paper has been cited 14 times. The authors confess, they grovel. We were careless when describing the inferences that could be made from our data. This led to the misuse of our article to support the position that the probability of being shot by police did not differ between Black and white Americans. Oh, you see, you got the Schrodinger's cat thing going again. Our paper says this, but on the other hand, our paper does not say that. And anyone who quotes our paper to the effect of what it actually says is incorrect. This is shameful behavior. To be clear, our work does not speak to this issue and should not be used to support such statements. We accordingly issue a correction to rectify this statement. Although our data and statistical approach were valid to estimate the question we actually tested, the race of civilians fatally shot by police, given a continued misuse of the article, e.g. Heather McDonald, 2020, we felt that the right decision was to retract the article rather than publish further corrections. We take full responsibility for not being careful enough with the inferences made in our original article, as this led directly to the misunderstanding of our research. No, we didn't say something in no less than the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I don't know, that would have perhaps a political use. Oh, no, heaven forbid, scientific studies are never used for political purposes. I'd like to give the example of Al Gore and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. When the federal authorities found Kaczynski's shack, on his reading table, they found a heavily marked up, annotated copy of Al Gore's Earth in the Balance. At the time, many people on the right said, ha, 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 Al Gore, this proves that you're an extremist, you support extremism. It does nothing of the sort. One cannot be held responsible for the uses of such work. It's simply, if that were the case, every book would be banned, because practically any book can be used to justify, any monograph, any novel, any poem can be used to justify any manner of immoral acts. Let's go to the chat here, see what we have. Michael Mabus says, how much porn do you have to watch to become a professor of lesbian studies? You might want to see whether you can get a grant there. You might want to see that. I rather suspect that there's a lot of research on that going on even as we speak. No lives matter should be the new mantra. I've been wondering about that because we've been hearing a great deal about how COVID-19 enables a reset of our economy, and the people behind climate emergency, or whatever they're calling it now, have been quite thrilled by the economic results of the hysterical COVID-19 shutdown. Now, I would think that these people would understand that if this shutdown or lockdown, whatever you want to call it, is to be extended and deepened, it is going to lead to a Malthusian die-off. But perhaps that's what they're looking for. Metal Mike says, burning down the Wendy's has already improved the health of the local community, so there's always an upside. As far as fast food restaurants go, I rather like Wendy's. That is to say that their hamburgers actually taste like meat, unlike, say, McDonald's. Okay. Jonathan Pohl says Don Lemon is dumber than an actual lemon. You know, he is on television, which is a kind of form of acting, but apparently no one has talked to him about his facial expression, which just looks moronic. It really does. But he just, I just reminded of Jesse Jackson when he was on Nightline some years ago, and he was railing against Henry Kissinger because Henry Kissinger, Jackson claimed, was in no position to understand racism. And I don't know, someone on the panel, and maybe perhaps Ted Koppel said, well, you know, Henry Kissinger did grow up as a child in Nazi Germany, so perhaps he knows something about racism. And Jackson's immoral response was, "You got me there." He also, in that interview, I remember, insisted that Adolf Hitler had not been elected in Germany. Too funny. Gangster culture is a serious problem. Well, it is. It is. And why do we want to talk about that? Why don't we want to talk about that? Because it would be an example of white supremacy to say, perhaps you should stop making songs that celebrate drug dealing and murder. Gangsters are the new police, says De Boreas. Defund police like they did in Communist Republic of South Africa, the murder capital of the world, rape capital of the world as well. Our Finnish friend, Jaakko Roipala, says, there's something really strange going on with the stream for me. I get notifications that the KMG show is live at totally random times, days after each stream has been aired. I don't know what to say about that. People have complaining about such things since this stream began. Are we going to talk about Ghislaine Maxwell? I talked about her yesterday, unless there's some new development. Not until there is a new development. Walrus Libertarian, the Tulsa myth, black streets paved with gold. Yes, the Black Wall Street. Jim Crow ended in '64. Indeed, it did. But William Hicks says, you'd think that the civil rights movement never happened. Why is there still a civil rights movement in America when all of the objectives of the movement were met by 1968? Every single one of them. Jogokin 666 says they started Tulsa. Indeed, they did. Michael Mavis, my great-grandpa once beat up your great-grandpa, so now I owe you 3 moon pies and a penny whistle. 3 generations since 1960. Indeed. Indeed. Jogokin 666, they destroyed a statue of Frederick Douglass, again, which suggests that it's not so much the Confederacy or so-called racism to which they object. It is history itself. D.B. Cooper says tablet seems to be surprisingly balanced. Yeah, I've seen recent things by Siegel which seem quite sound. I'm suggesting that I'm thinking that a lot of these liberals are getting quite scared for all sorts of reasons because they have a commitment to liberalism, and liberalism is dead. Perhaps they don't recognize that. But also they're beginning to fear for their own place. Because to say today that one is a liberal is to pretty much call oneself a, racist, sexist, misogynist, white supremacist, or whatever? Because the arc of history bends towards justice, and justice is Black Lives Matter. YT says, yeah, everyone now states their color, trans status, oppression level. It's nauseating. I'll be getting to that shortly. Justin Proto says leftist jargon is uttered by meat robots. The fact that it is caught on so easily and as widespread as it has shows just how many meat golems are out there. It's the media, isn't it? It's the media. I mean, you had the print media and radio, which were very powerful, but then television, which was always on. There was always that box with the black and white screen. Beaming messages into your house. Then we got the internet, which was interactive. And then we got social media. So let's go with the first thought. Let's go R.I.P. Ellen, say, which I'm going to be talking about a little later. We are now in complete Soviet speak, says Justin Proto. Just about. My trail of disgrace. Black Twitter is replete with Marxist ideological language like whiteness. But wait a minute. This makes my head hurt. I thought whiteness didn't exist. That's why we don't capitalize it. Unlike blackness, which is monolithic, apparently, or Bishop Talbot Swan's fave, caucasity. Mary Crow says, Kevin, have you heard that Toronto outlawed the Holy Eucharist? I heard this from an Orthodox friend in Canada. I have not heard this. I will certainly look into it. Chogokin 666, who is most cowardly, media, academy, or politicians? Well, politicians, by far. And we're going to be talking about one soon enough. John Tory, the mayor of Toronto. Visionary companion, all laws are racist. The law of gravity is racist. Marion Barry. I don't know whether Marion Barry actually said this, but it seems like the sort of thing that he would say, perhaps when he was on a crack binge. Okay, let's see. Central Park Karen has left the chat. I feel sorry for that woman. I really do. These sort of contretemps happen in the United States, by the thousands, tens of thousands, every day. And usually, I don't know, people might have heightened tempers for some time afterwards, or they may moan about what happened to them, but they're generally forgotten soon enough. Now they lead to severe and permanent consequences. William Hicks, sexual assault, Dr. Ford, a story of not being raped. Kavanaugh, his buddy, tried, but not very hard. The magic toppling bed allowed her to break free and run out of the room. Yeah, again, you see this conflation. Rape is a very powerful word, but it's been replaced in the legal lexicon with sexual assault, which is nebulous. But then you will have people, as Metal Mike says, say that groping is rape. Mike F. says, Christopher Caldwell talks about that in his book, asks students to name 10 most important Americans, and 8 will be black. Dr. Ford's story was so incredibly bad, but the spineless Republicans were too intimidated by Me Too to throw the book at her. She should have been charged with lying to Congress. I don't know. I would have been tempted to say, in all seriousness, yes, Dr. Ford. We appreciate you coming here to testify, especially considering your condition. What condition is that? Well, you seem to have some sort of respiratory ailment. Why are you talking like a little girl? Michael Mabus, if America is so bad, why is there an avalanche of immigration applications for people all over the world who want to go there, causing people to urge that it opens its borders? Again, Schrodinger's cat. Okay, there is no point in making this argument with people who are not, let's say, on the fence or normies. If you like. Contra says, the madness we are living through now is a direct result of the mental mush being spread by public schools and universities. That has a great deal to do with it. And as I've mentioned before, the right thought it was very amusing to laugh about this stuff, going back to, the 1980s. Not, for instance, seek what they could do through the legislatures to shut off funding or to institute regulations such that this sort of madness is no longer promulgated in the universities. Okay. Asata Shakur will get a monument on the National Mall before long. Was that Tupac's mother? Tupac, interestingly enough, went to prison for sexual assault. Here's the story. Sounds like I'm making it up. I'm not. That he had consensual sexual intercourse with a woman. And later, after they both got dressed, he grabbed her buttocks. And he was charged, convicted, and sent to prison. Again, sounds crazy, but it's not. Aslan says, Angela supposedly studied in Germany. I do not believe the shtick that she speaks German well enough to be a German PhD. Is that referring to Angela Merkel or Angela Davis? Walrus Libertarian says they don't realize that gobbledygook talk doesn't work outside lefty academia, but it does. It's used in PR. It's used in corporate relations. It's used in management talk. I suppose the goal is that everyone is supposed to talk like this, or we can immediately, that you can judge people, where they came from by their accents. Well, now we can judge people by their use of language. That if they speak about silenced, I have trouble with this word because they just made it up 5 minutes earlier, indigeneity, then you know which tribe they belong to. Okay. What does Chad Chadson have to say here? Okay. There was a reference there. Yeah, pimping. A lot of rap music talks up the pimp, which is sexual slavery. But let's not get into that. Walrus Libertarian says the Eucharist being outlawed is real in Toronto. Singing in choirs. I've heard about the singing in choirs. Josh Randall says, not sure I can continue my relationship with liberal friends. It's sad, but the things they believe and parrot are so dangerous. They sound like agents of the state. It used to be that you could talk about sports with these people, but of course, since everything is Black Lives Matter now, or as I mentioned a few days ago, that you can't even enjoy a Mother's Day at the ballpark without being reminded of breast cancer. Okay, let's talk about Toronto, which is the wokest city in Canada. And they have a very woke mayor called John Tory, who's the fag end of the Canadian aristocracy. He loves drag queens. In fact, I mentioned Mother's Day. A few years ago at a Mother's Day, he went to some sort of event celebrating drag queens. They can't be mothers. Well, they can't bear children. And he was filmed, once again, I'm not making this up, slipping money into the underwear of one of these drag queens on a day in which we honor mothers. Non-medical masks become mandatory in indoor public spaces in Toronto today, reports the CBC. The temporary bylaw will remain in effect until at least the end of September. Temporary, eh? The lockdown was supposed to be temporary too. COVID-19, it's pretty much finished in Canada. Pretty much finished. But now Ottawa has decided that everyone must wear masks, and Toronto, which is the largest city in Canada, has decided that everyone must wear masks. We are being terrified. This is the whole point. The point of masks is to humiliate people and to terrify everyone else. City Council voted to make the move last week after Toronto's medical officer of health, Dr. Eileen Devia, who's not a Canadian, by the way, recommended it in a report that was also endorsed by Mayor John Tory. It's about respecting and protecting each other. We hope that there are more and more people out in the stores and the businesses across the city. We want that to happen for the sake of our economy and for the sake of returning to a nearer to normal kind of life. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. It's about respect. It's not about medical efficacy, and I will get to that a little later. John Tory is very woke indeed, but that did not stop. Let's see, this is from Blog TL. Rent protest outside Toronto Mayor John Tory's home turns violent. A peaceful protest? You mean it was peaceful until it stopped being peaceful? It's like, yeah, that relationship there between the man behind the counter and the man in front of the counter was perfectly peaceful until, he brought out his pistol and said, give me all your money or I'll blow your head off. But the media just can't help themselves. A peaceful protest against the looming prospect of mass residential evictions turned into a dramatic standoff last night outside the posh Yorkville condo residence of Toronto Mayor John Tory. Hundreds of advocates had gathered outside the Ontario legislature in Queen's Park on Monday evening to voice their disapproval of Bill 184, which critics say will pave the way for landlords to evict tenants with greater ease than prior to the pandemic. Let's see, Toronto Acorn tweets, Bill 184 is an attack on low and moderate income communities. We need to shut it down. Tenants are rising up against Ford, that would be Premier Ford's attack on our homes. Do these people know that John Tory has nothing to do with this legislation? I'm, greatly enjoying his discomfiture, but he has nothing to do with it. He is mayor of Toronto. He's not premier of Ontario. He's not a member of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. But never mind that. Never mind that. There were 109,173 deaths in Ontario last year. And let's see how many people have died from COVID-19 so far in the province of Ontario. 2,689. Despite the fact that, at least half of these deaths were due to the disastrous policy of the provincial government in putting infected people into nursing homes. But let's not talk about that. Let's not bring that up. Let's all wear masks. Masks for everyone all the time. You realize if they get away with this, they're going to force us to wear masks forever. Because flu season's coming up. We're not that far from winter now. Flu season's coming up. Can we afford to be irresponsible and not wear masks? They want us to wear masks all the time. And it looks like they'll get away with it. Something like 3/4 of Canadians say they favor mandatory mask laws. This is manufactured consent because they've been told just how wicked they are if they do not support this, even though my own experience outside in the streets of Victoria is that 5 to 10% of the people are wearing masks, and most of them that I see wearing masks are Oriental. Ontario will not be expanding the size of allowable gatherings before regions enter stage 3 of the province's reopening plan, the province's health minister confirmed Tuesday. Christine Elliott. The public health doctors who have been advising us are asking that we proceed in stages and not to do things incrementally. Oh, God forbid, incrementally. That's the worst. Because they really want to see the effects of everything that we've done at a particular stage and its effects on public health. How would they know this? How could they test it? It is untestable. The claim that they are making that this lockdown saved lives in Ontario is unfalsifiable. It's simply a tautology. Under stage 2 of the province's reopening plan, gatherings of no more than 10 people are permitted. As of today, all regions in Ontario are permitted to enter stage 2. Wow, 10 people. 10 people. The province has not said when regions will be allowed to enter the final stage, which will involve the reopening of businesses such as fitness studios and movie theaters, which have been closed since March. Health officials have said there would need to be a consistent decline in the number of new cases and hospitalizations in order to proceed to the next stage. Well, that's already happened. It's already happened. New cases in the province are continuing to trend downward, with 112 new cases confirmed today, the second lowest number of new cases in months. It's all over. But the public health bureaucrats, the public health dictators are unwilling to give up their dictatorial control, and the politicians are too craven to seize it from them. Oh, there were vast Black Lives Matter protests in Toronto recently. But as we know, these get-togethers do not spread COVID-19 because COVID-19 is a very righteous disease, which attacks people. No, wait a minute. Apparently, it's attacking more men than women, but more people of color than. It's an intersectional minefield. A club that allegedly hosted up to 150 people at a secret party in downtown Toronto last month is losing one of its shareholders, who happens to be one of the city's most well-known entrepreneurs. Michelle Romanow, who appears on CBC's Dragon's Den and is at the helm of several other businesses, claims she didn't know the event was taking place and wasn't in the city at the time of the incident. Police allege that Goldie nightclub, which does not have a permit for outdoor service or an outdoor patio or seating area, hosted an indoor party with no distancing measures in place on the evening of June the 26th. It's estimated that 125 to 150 guests were allegedly brought in through the back of the establishment, according to police. Events of this nature are currently prohibited in Ontario in order to stop the spread of COVID-19 under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. As a result, police say that the owner-manager and corporation behind Goldie will be charged with failing to comply with an order made during a declared emergency. That's all you need to strip us of our civil rights, is declare an emergency. And again, let's go after people who want to have fun, as opposed to people who want to scream slogans in the streets. Toronto used to be called Toronto the Good. I suppose up to about the 1960s. It was a Presbyterian city. I don't believe that the movie theaters were allowed to open in Toronto until the 1970s. But now Toronto the Good, I suppose it's good in a Puritan sense. Popular Ontario beach partially closing after human behavior at its worst on Canada Day. And there's a picture here of human behavior at its worst, which is people sitting on the beach. A popular Ontario beach will mostly close again after reckless crowds packed the tourist destination to a whole new level on Canada Day, officials say. In an emergency meeting on Thursday, council said that they are partially reclosing Wasaga Beach because of the blatant disrespect by tourists visiting on Wednesday. It's always the tourists, is it? Last week, our beachfront was busy, but yesterday, Canada Day, it was taken to a whole new level, Town of Wasaga Beach Mayor Nina Bifolchi said in the meeting. Deputy Fire Chief Craig Williams added to Bifolchi's comment, saying the crowds made it clear the public is unable to safely manage themselves. Over the last 2 weekends, and especially yesterday on Canada Day, we saw human behavior at its worst. Wow. This Williams fellow sounds awfully naive. I can think of many manifestations of behavior which would be much worse than going to a beach and sitting on the sand. Many visitors displayed reckless disregard for guidelines and ignored physical distancing recommendations. The town has now written to Premier Doug Ford to raise concerns about the influx of people in the community. Wow, that sounds really xenophobic to me. Tom Hanks is in the news again. And does anyone else find it rather odd that Tom Hanks and his lovely lady wife were among the very first Westerners to be diagnosed with COVID-19, despite the fact that he was in Australia, a country with very few cases and very few deaths? Tom Hanks and his wife. Tom Hanks has become a crusader now. Just a coincidence, I suppose. This is from the LA Times. COVID-19 survivor Tom Hanks has a message for anyone unwilling to do their part to stop the spread of the respiratory illness. Appearing Tuesday on NBC's Today, Hanks reflected on his own early bout with the coronavirus and questioned why some weren't taking the pandemic seriously. He also plugged his new movie. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19. The idea of doing one's part, though, should be so simple. Wear a mask, social distance, wash your hands, Hanks told host Hoda Kotb. That alone means you are contributing to the betterment of your house, your work, your town, your society as a whole. It sounds very Soviet, doesn't it? And it's such a small thing. It's a mystery to me how somehow that's been wiped out of what should be ingrained in the behavior of us all. Ingrained, no less. Although the screen icon believes the vast majority of Americans understand the importance of protecting themselves and others, he didn't mince words when laying out the dangers some have chosen to ignore. Quote, look, there's no law against ignorance. It's not illegal to have opinions that are wrong. Not yet. Not yet. But there is a darkness on the edge of town here, folks. Wow, that seems to be a kind of a theme here this week. And let's not confuse the fact it's killing people. Yeah, that's right. It's killing people. And you can say, well, traffic accidents kill an awful lot of people too. A traffic accident happened because a lot of drivers aren't doing their part. I don't know how common sense has somehow been put in question. Yes, as I say, remarkable, remarkable coincidence. And I think we should be so grateful that Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson found themselves in Australia when they did. One might say that it is providential. Let's look at the figures from Australia. Active cases, 2,250, recovered 6,210, deaths, 106. That's fewer than the number of deaths in my province of British Columbia, which has 5.1 million people. Australia has 25.5 million people. How did this ever get to be considered even a crisis, let alone a catastrophe? How many deaths were there in Australia in the last year for which there are full figures? To 2018, 158,493. 17,500 died of heart disease. 14,000 died of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. And see, the fact is that people die every day. In the United States, it's about 2.8 million people every day. But once again, I've come to the conclusion that most people, even the college educated, cannot appreciate numbers larger than 1,000. Paul Marx tweets to Peter Hitchens, the old view of law was that of the common law, that a crime is an intentional aggression against someone else. But now the view of Thomas Hobbes and Jeremy Bentham rule that a crime is disobeying an instruction of the rulers and has nothing to do with private rights. And Hitchens comments a very important point. Yes, positive law as opposed to common law. And you can strip, as happened in Britain and England, an entire nation of its rights by simply talking about emergency and claiming that what you're doing is going to save lives, and even one life lost is too many, which is absurd, of course. It's worse than absurd. A study was carried out by the National Cancer Institute, and they have confirmed that thousands will die from undiagnosed and untreated cancers. Their analysis is conservative because they only evaluated 2 types of cancer. Lisa Keeble comments, people die from things other than COVID. Yeah, indeed. But we've forgotten that now because apparently people only die of COVID, and Black Lives Matter, COVID lives matter, only COVID lives matter. Let's be reminded of what the World Health Organization had to say about masks. This is from Dr. April Baller of The WHO. Masks should only be used by healthcare workers, caretakers, or by people who are sick with symptoms like fever and cough. Guess who else said this? Dr. Anthony Fauci said this. And then he changed his tune for reasons that remain obscure. And also Dr. Theresa Tam, the sainted chief medical officer of Canada, also said the same thing about masks. And then she changed her tune for reasons that remain obscure. Once again, there is no consensus, absolutely no consensus whatsoever on the efficacy of ordinary people wearing masks, particularly outdoors. Let's see what Toby Young has to say. You find it strange that it was COVID, And then Black Lives Matter came along, and it's like, oh, the narrative is slipping away. The narrative is slipping away. Oh my God, we have tens of thousands of people marching on the street with no social distancing, and many of them not wearing masks. And whoa, this is narrative breakdown here. Y'all got to wear masks. We're all going to die. The second spike is coming. COVID-19 is never going to end. The world is never going to be the same. Get used to living on nothing, I suppose. Refusing to wear a mask in public should become as socially unacceptable as drink driving, or what we call drunk driving here, or not wearing a seatbelt, the president of the Royal Society has said. Venki Ramakrishnan called for everyone to be required to wear a mask in all indoor public settings rather than only on public transport, and criticized confused messaging from the government. This follows the publication of two Royal Society reports, one of which purports to show that wearing masks reduces transmission of the virus, and the other which documents how far the UK is trailing behind other countries when it comes to face coverings. They're not trailing behind Canada, that's for sure, or certainly where I live. Wearing a mask did not bother our Italian, French, or Spanish neighbors, none of whom were used to wearing one before the pandemic, now do so routinely. Yes, they want to turn us all into Chinese. Got to bring up that social credit level. Toby Young says, I've had a look at the Royal Society paper that supposedly confirms the effectiveness of masks. It's unimpressive. Note the threadbare evidence on which it bases its sweeping conclusion, quote, we have found only 2 randomized control trials in the primary literature on the use of face masks to reduce onward transmission. One was underpowered, and the other showed significant reduction when adjusted for actual mask usage in a post hoc analysis. Congratulations, Venki Ramakrishnan. You win Bedwetter of the Week. 81% of care home residents asymptomatic. This is pretty extraordinary. According to a UK government study, 80.9% of residents in care homes for the over 65 in England who tested positive for COVID-19 were asymptomatic. Yeah, this is a disease which is extremely dangerous to people who are, well, over 80. Over 80. Let's see. So COVID-19 is not a death sentence for the over 65. Who knew? Well, Dr. Scott Atlas does, the senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and former chief of neuroradiology at Stanford University Medical Center, has given an interview to Fox News in which he says that for those under 70, the mortality rate for COVID-19 is lower than it is for seasonal flus. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson has put his foot in it by suggesting care home managers are to blame for the high death toll in the sector. The Prime Minister said on Monday that too many care homes didn't really follow the rules. That's a bit rich, considering the chief executive of the National Health Service ordered hospitals to discharge as many patients as possible in March without checking first to make sure they weren't carrying COVID-19. Given the number of infectious people flooding into care homes as a result of that diktat, I'm not sure following more rigorous social distancing policies in these settings would have made any difference. And yeah, it's a Holocaust. Really, it's a mass die-off, except that it isn't. Local ONS data shows deaths below 5-year average for second week in a row. Yes. Readers will recall that last Tuesday, the ONS data for week 25 showed that the number of people dying in England and Wales had fallen below the 5-year average, suggesting that some of the people who've died from coronavirus would have died later in the year anyway. The same is true for week 26. There's a controversy in Britain now as to whether the arts should be bailed out. I'm rather torn about this. On the one hand, I think that the arts are a public good, but most of what we call the arts now have been so compromised by politics or by radical theories or practices, such as the so-called reggae theater, which has deformed opera, to give one example. James Delling-Pole writes that these they should be able to make it on their own, but I don't know. Is it a good idea that government money is spent so that symphonies can be performed? I think that it is, actually. Others will disagree. An extraordinary piece in the National Geographic, wildly alarmist, even by the standards of the mainstream media. It includes this incredible statement. Using a more sophisticated calculation called the infection fatality rate, paired with the past few months' worth of data, the latest best estimates show that COVID-19 is about 50 to 100 times more lethal than the seasonal flu on average. So what exactly is this more sophisticated way of calculating the IFR? Apparently the ones made by the University of Wollongong epidemiologist and self-described health nerd, Gideon Meyerowitz Katz. Yeah. For my part, Toby Young says, I'll stick with the CDC's estimate of IFR of 0.26%, about 2.5 times higher than that of the IFR of the average seasonal flu. But the more people that get exposed, infected, that number is going to fall. It's going to fall and fall and fall. According to a poll, only 5% of Britons have visited a pub since they reopened. Why so few? Presumably because the above Times cartoon sums up how many Britons are feeling, having been subjected to months of unrelenting death porn in the BBC. And there's a bunch of morons on the street, and one of them has his arm around the Grim Reaper, and he says, the second round's on you, mate. Yeah, you don't want people to go out to drink anymore. You want people to drink at home alone. I would gather, and there have been anecdotal reports that alcoholism has absolutely soared throughout the Western world. That's not a good thing, is it? On Saturday night, when I've had a few too many Toby Young reports, I produced a slightly unhinged Twitter thread about the Cultural Revolution. Here it is for those who missed it. Thought I'd do a thread about reasons to be cheerful about the Cultural Revolution. All of these are variations on the same theme. The Red Guards have seized cultural power, but not political power. It's a coup in which the revolutionaries have secured the public broadcaster, but not the military. They don't have a monopoly over the legitimate use of force. They can't murder or imprison counter-revolutionaries, just cancel them. And that means the coup will fail. Take universities, art schools, dance schools, drama schools, colleges of further education, etc. The coup has been 100% successful in those institutions. There's literally zero tolerance from any dissent from woke orthodoxy across the HE sector. Yes, it's good to hear. It's good to hear such optimistic views. The professor of whiteness studies at the University of Central Bedfordshire will lose his £120,000 a year taxpayer-subsidized job and end up driving an Uber where his ability to make converts will be confined to drunk couples snogging on the back seat. That's based on his assumption that what he called the Wocus Dei religious seminaries, that is to say the universities, will go bankrupt. One can only hope. One can only hope. Again, you know, my advice to you is when you hear people say that, oh, more people should be going to college, or that everyone should be go to college, or that even 50% of people should go to college, the question, you know, why? Why? What are they getting out of it? And you will note at this point the silence. Well, though they're getting an education. Are they getting an education in what? Because we know for a fact that many of the graduates are ignorant of some of the most basic facts about human history, philosophy, theology, geography, literature, whatever. That is to say, one can get a university degree whilst having learned very little indeed. Let's see what Alex Berenson has to say. He's praising Trump for demanding that schools reopen in September. No, I'm sure that there are some parents who are bedwetters and who are terrified about this. There are far more parents who are going to go mad, or who are going to, let's say, get quite stroppy, if you will, if the schools are not, in fact, opened in September. Of course, we could always simply fire the teachers or put them on furlough, you know. And then when they're not getting paid anymore, then that might change. That might change their view. Berenson writes, if Arizona, Florida, and Texas really start to roll over in the next 10 days, where does Team Apocalypse go next? I guess long haul COVID. It doesn't matter if you don't die, were never hospitalized, or never even knew you were sick. This is still a devastating illness. Let's see, Texas. Yep, COVID deaths have soared all the way to an average of 35 a day, where they were in mid-May when the state had about 1/5 as many cases. By the way, Texas has 31 million people and about 600 of them die every day. So moving on, a woman called Anne Helen Peterson. She's chosen as an avatar, a picture of a well-known silent film actress. She's not anywhere near as good looking as her avatar, but that's not unusual. She is very upset that they had a prom in rural Montana. She is touting the hipness or the hippening of places like Montana and Idaho, Wyoming. This is not good news for those places. I suppose there'll be a better supply of cheese or whatever. There'll be more poetry slams. But these people whose political beliefs have wrecked their states are now moving in large numbers to previously unpaused states, such as, Idaho and Wyoming and Montana, and also to Eastern Washington, where apparently Spokane, of all places, is now being hippeninged. Call it MORP all you want. You still had a shit ton of teens together at the country club during a pandemic. A lot of block capitals there. Oh, isn't it weird how having a prom during a pandemic, even in rural Montana, would lead to mass exposure? Oh, and this follows a news report. Everyone who attended MORP event in Choteau is urged to get tested. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. There are an awful lot of French names in that part of the United States, but years ago I found out that what I thought was pronounced Pierre is pronounced Pierre, and there are many other such examples. The chances of these young people who are, 17, 18 years old, becoming sick from exposure to COVID-19 is practically zero. But no one is allowed to have fun in the state of Montana, according to Anne Helen Peterson, if she disapproves. Yeah, let's see. Oh, yes, mid-sized city migration and the coolification of places like Tulsa, Boise, Des Moines, Spokane, and more. Yeah, well, it sounds like a nightmare to me. I'm trying to think of the woman that she's using here. It's, lost it. Almost had it. She supposedly was involved with members of the football team, a whole bunch of them. And once, Clara Bow, that's the one. Oh, yes. And Anne Helen Peterson is very upset that Bethel, Ohio does not want Black Lives Matter there. It's just a shocking incident where a school teacher decided to bring a BLM into this village of 2,800. And the townsfolk overwhelmingly said, no sale. People were screaming at us to go back where we came from. And when Darcy, who attended the demonstration with her mom and sister, recalled, and when? Never come across that before. But I was looking around and I saw Mrs. Dennis, who'd been a teacher for 30 years. There's a shocker. I saw my mom, who'd been on the PTA for years and served as the drama director. I saw the woman who ran all the prom fundraisers and the city councilman. The people yelling at us weren't from here, because if they were, they would have known we were home. And there's a picture of one of these woke women, and she looks exactly as one would imagine She is wearing a very odd sort of dress. Her name is Alicia G, which rather looks like an apron, actually, which has a bunch of stickers attached to it, or some sort of medallions with the woman symbol and a bunch of slogans. She has a tattoo on her arm. She has her hair in pigtails. She is noticeably overweight, and she is wearing red problem glasses. Oh, she has the fringe, too. Oh, let's see. Alicia G has chunky auburn bangs, oversized glasses with thick red frames, and the general look of a high school art teacher on a teen CW comedy. Well, you're not really making the case for Alicia G having some sort of plenary powers over Bethel, Ohio. Not really at all. Yes, after she posted the announcement, when she woke up, there were messages on the post in her inbox with the same theme: "You can't bring this into our town." Let's see. There's this common narrative that if someone stands for Black lives, then it's automatically a protest. Now, why would that be a common narrative? And if it's a protest, then it's automatically a riot, which is automatically looting and bussing in people who will swarm the town and destroy it. Not that far from the truth. Perhaps a bit of hyperbole there. And the Antifa rumors that had been working their way through small towns didn't help. I had a conversation with the mayor, and he wanted to know if any of the organizers were Antifa, G told me. And he had this very confused look on his face when I told him that we're all against fascism, but Antifa isn't like an organized group the way he thought it was. No, Antifa doesn't exist, but it's also very powerful at the same time, you see. Got the Schrodinger's cat thing goes. We're all against fascism. Is that something that people in small town Ohio worry about much? Fascism? Is there much experience of fascism in Ohio? The plans for a Black Lives Matter event pissed a lot of people off. But one of the people that upset was Lonnie Mead. Mead grew up in Bethel, installs floors, and in his spare time is a pretty successful drag racer. Ooh, sounds scary. He posts frequently to Facebook, mixing memes about political correctness with photos of his cars and young daughter. And this is the guy who stepped forward to save Bethel from Black Lives Matter. My hats off to you. Let's go back to the chat. Danny Rose says, in Missouri last night, my city council passed a 90-day indoor-outdoor mask ordinance, $15 fine if violated. Outdoors as well. Okay, Brandon Smith says, hard to believe that in 10 years we're going to look back on this madness as the good old days. Don't tell me that. Don't tell me that. Thermidor, that's what we're looking forward to. Thermidor. Ezra St. White says, anyone figure out why they call these people woke? What are they woke to? Well, they're woke to, reality, I suppose. They're woke to the arc of history bending towards justice. Tom Anderson says, my county sheriff is refusing to enforce the governor's mask order. Good for him. Media Hit says, a big sign at the edge of town that says no Black Lives Matter, and you hear the click of shotguns. Hicks adds, Bethel, Ohio is Harley country. Those bikers don't mess around. There'll be no racial reckoning down there. Sorry about that disclosure. I was born and raised in Southwest Ohio. De Boreas says $15 is like buying city bonds. LOL. Jonathan Pohl, Mussolini has been dead since 1945. Well, yes. Yes, indeed. One could point out that Franco and Salazar were not really fascists. But these people aren't really interested in history. Would you say that Pinochet was a fascist? No, I wouldn't. He was an authoritarian dictator. No question about that. As was Franco. Franco had his phalangists. The phalangists had fought bravely in the Civil War. He had to keep them part of his movement, but they had very little to do with administration of Franco's Spain. GIJD, is that Dutch? Woke is about millennial Black people realizing that racism still exists and harm them. Oh, I see. Okay. Mike F. Woke means realizing you've been brainwashed by the white man. Oh, is there a lot of that about? Because I seem to be hearing the contrary narrative ceaselessly, just ceaselessly. Come on, this stuff was on TV and the movies from the 1960s. I thought that every black man was Sidney Poitier, in To Serve with Love or In the Heat of the Night, because those are the kind of blacks that you saw on TV and the movies. And they're better than white people. That's what the movies and TV have been telling us since the 1960s. And the television commercials, which I suppose people watch more than any particular show, have been telling us for decades that white people are idiots. And in particular, that white men are idiots. Who is more likely to do something objectively stupid in public? Well, that's obviously white men. That's what we've been getting. But no, apparently it's all support of white supremacy. Tom Anderson, is there really no escape from the madness? Well, I suppose one can have families and one can try to protect them from it. I suppose they'd have to homeschool, seriously, because the schools were, when my old children who were millennials were in schools, I used to just hear hair-raising stories about what they spent their days doing. It certainly wasn't learning. And I found out that teachers boasting about failing grades, like failing grade 2, unless you had a serious medical problem in grade 2, you could only fail grade 2 if you were really stupid. And this person became a school teacher, or complaining about the other teachers in the school, making fun of them. Keep in mind that my children went to a high school, which was, I think, rated second best in the whole of Vancouver Island in terms of academic performance. Yes, Versailles, Kentucky is pronounced Versailles. Yes, as I said, yes, I've been caught out by that in the past. Not that particular city, but Pierre instead of Pierre. Okay, so let's talk now about, oh yes, view mask refusers like drink drivers. Yeah, we talked about that earlier, but Shayla Love has a piece in Vice. Is racism a mental illness? If racism was thought of as a mental disorder, would it help the efforts to make the world a less racist place or make them harder? That's a real thumbsucker there. And let's get personal. Shayla Love, she's got to get personal. She has a personal investment in this question, which she, of course, is going to confess to us, that she has OCD. Well, of course she does. You can't be a millennial now without having one of such conditions, and preferably more. Actually, I don't think that one is sufficient. But she's described as a senior staff member for Vice, covering science, health, psychology, and climate. And of course, she lives in Brooklyn. Oh, I wrote about the desire to classify racism as a mental illness, which is decades old, originating from Black mental health providers, that vast cohort in the United States. But racist beliefs, while confusing, upsetting, and wrong, can't be understood only as mental disorders. You see what's going on here? Is dipping the toe in the water, okay? That we've seen this with pedophilia or minor attracted persons, as we hear. Oh, I'm not saying, they will argue that, this should be legalized, but perhaps it's time for a new approach here. Because, most of these people, they don't really constitute any kind of a threat. This is just fantasy on their part. And, they are motivated by love above all. Vice is the print arm of Antifa. And so Vice taking a position, even tentatively, that we should declare racism a mental illness. Now, I thought that mental illness was supposed to be destigmatized. Isn't that what I've been hearing for years, decades now? On the Oprah Winfrey Show in 1992, yeah, that's where you want to start. Jane Elliott, the educator, known for teaching students about prejudice by biasing them against blue or brown eyes, came to an incisive conclusion about racism. What we're dealing with here is mental illness, she said. Members of the audience started clapping. Racism is a mental illness. If you judge other people by the color of their skin, by the amount of a chemical in their skin, you have a mental problem. You are not dealing well with reality. Oh, okay, but apparently this only applies to white people. And I will mention in this regard again, Peter Simple's The Prejudometer, which is available from Ethnic AIDS, which you just hold it up against a person, and it gives you the reading in Prejudons, the internationally accepted scientific unit of racism. But as he pointed out, that in instances where people who are not white attempt to use the vice on people who are not white, it can overheat or even explode. So I guess if people are mental ill for being racist, then what is racist? Anyway, again, don't accept this. Don't accept this term, because to accept the term racism is pretty much to have surrendered the argument right from the beginning. This grainy television clip has been recirculating on social media due to the explosion of online advocacy from the current Black Lives Matter protest. Google searches for racism is a mental illness have spiked to a level unseen over the last 10 years. Golly, I wonder why that might be. Manufactured consent, anyone? And on Twitter, many have declaratively shared the sentiment. Every possible sentiment is declaratively shared on Twitter. The belief that someone isn't your equal because of the way they look must mean that that person's brain isn't working correctly. These people are saying they are ill. What about people who are deformed in some way, perhaps grossly deformed? I mean, clearly, and I don't mean to be insulting here, I'm just stating a fact, that people who are blind are not equal to people who can see. People who are deaf are not equal to people who can hear. These are, serious deformations. Of course, people judge other people by the way they look. This has always been the case, and it has always been the case. But the comparison of racism to mental illness, whatever mental illness means, by the way, can we have a definition of what mental illness is? Because I found out, in recent decades that actually I've been pretty good about this in recent years, but I used to bite my fingernails terribly. I'm a rather nervous person, and I discovered that this was a mental illness. Yes, indeed. Or jogging one of my legs or both of my legs in nervousness. This is, in fact, a mental illness as well. Is there any human behavior now that is not construed as a mental illness? If more than half of the people demonstrate some form of mental illness, isn't this behavior normative then? Oh, calling racism a mental illness perpetuates the stigma around mental illnesses. Yeah, why would there be a stigma around what we call mental illnesses, like schizophrenia, say? Just because people believe that aliens are sending messages through their molars and informing them that, an alliance of the British royal family, the Martians, and the Jews are running the world, and also sending them messages that they should kill their mothers because their mothers are responsible for this. Why would there be a stigma around that kind of behavior? This would continue the practice of using mental health language in a derogatory way. Think calling situations or people you don't like crazy or insane. Yeah, that's not going to end either. The push to define racism as a mental illness is decades old, though, and originally came for mental health providers. In 1969, a group of prominent Black psychiatrists, how many Black psychiatrists were there in the United States in 1969? Not psychologists, but psychiatrists. How many? I'm guessing in the entirety of America, it was less than 100, perhaps less than 50. Let's see. asking whether extreme racism is a mental illness, often goes along with trying to understand extremely racist acts. How was anyone to make sense of white police officers tackling a 23-year-old Elijah McClain to the ground, putting him in a carotid hold as he cried, vomited, and that he couldn't breathe and pleaded to go to his home nearby? If it was a Black or Asian police officer that had done this to Elijah McClain, would that be an extremely racist act? It seems to be that we've talked about people being racialized. Now we have behavior as being racialized. If policemen were routinely seeking out people who could not even be described as having committed a crime, or threatened, there's some suspicion of them committing a crime, and attack them, that would be one thing. But George Floyd had committed a crime. Just as Mike Brown, the gentle giant, had committed a crime, just as Saint Trayvon had committed a crime. Oh yes, it was a mental disturbance in Jackson, Mississippi in 1965 because you couldn't reason with people over it. Oh, they're all about reason. Are they? No, it's very simple whether you agree with it or not. These people in Jackson, Mississippi did not want a desegregation. How does that make them mad? Is Jackson, Mississippi a better place now than it was in 1965? Some expert, Poussant is his name, he thinks that cases like 21-year-old Dylan Roof, who killed 9 people at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, are in this category. I think that Dylan Roof was a man who became radicalized and then did something really stupid and evil, which to kill 9 nice church ladies. Perhaps he was imitating Anders Breivik. If racism is a mental illness, it pushes the problem onto white people, Poussant said. Oh, okay. There's no mental illness among Black people. They're not even bothering to hide the narrative here. You see, white people are uniformly, not only systemically racist, they're all mad. They're all mad because if white people are all systemically racist, and if racism is a mental illness, then white people must be mad. I don't know, shut it down. That's what I say. Shut it down. Why is this nonsense being funded? And again, I would say, look at your elected politicians, because the Republicans in the United States have been in power, often with control of 3 branches. Conservatives, so-called, in Canada have been in charge. Why didn't they turn off the taps to this poisonous nonsense? Because they're afraid. They're absolutely afraid. But the thing is that their enemies were not going to hate them even more if they did this. They might actually be frightened. Because again, our enemies have been kicking down opened doors for decades. Let's look at the tremendous struggle for gay rights. What tremendous struggle are we talking about? It was ridiculously easy. Speaking of madness, there's a piece by Philip Giraldi on UNS, Russia baiting is the only game in town. There are further sanctions on Russia now, and we have this bogus story. Where are the documents, by the way, that the Kremlin has been paying the Afghan Taliban bounties to kill American soldiers? Not that they would ever want to do that. Initial Times coverage, which claimed that the activity had been confirmed by both intelligence sources and money tracking, was supplemented by delusional nonsense from former Obama National Security Advisor Susan Rice, who asks, why does Trump put Russia first? These people, they want a war or a coup or both. They're actively accusing Trump of treason. He was accused of treason for going to Helsinki to meet Vladimir Putin. Ronald Reagan went to Reykjavik to meet Mikhail Gorbachev, and the world was a much better place as a result. But of course, the neocons were calling Reagan a traitor. And once again, when you hear these neocons carry on about their beloved Ronnie Reagan, you might want to point out to them that they're liars. That Reagan refused to go along with their lunatic belief that the Soviet Union was attempting to secure a first strike capability. But Giraldi, he points out something which I've mentioned previously, which is very frightening indeed, which is that Susan Rice, who is being mentioned as a possible Biden choice for vice president, she certainly knows about swift and significant U.S. response, as she was one of the architects of the destruction of Libya and the escalation of U.S. military and intelligence operations directed against a non-threatening Syria. You may have heard of the British historian David Starkey, who's been a very controversial person for quite some time. He's this old homosexual, and until the other day, he didn't really care that some people were upset by what he said. This is from the Mail. David Starkey has issued an apology after saying slavery was not genocide because there are so many damn blacks around. The historian and presenter 75 made the comments during an online interview with Brexit campaigner Darren Grimes for a YouTube channel Reasoned UK while addressing BLM. In a lengthy statement today, Starkey admitted that his bad mistake has cost him every distinction and honor acquired in a long career. Well, he is 75 years old. He said that his principal regret was that his blundering use of language could endanger people's rights to freedom of speech. Oh, Canterbury. CC Uni, we have terminated David Starkey's position as visiting professor with immediate effect. His comments are completely unacceptable and totally go against our university and community values. See, the question of genocide had come up, and he pointed out the obvious, that there are many, yes, he said slavery was not genocide. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many damn blacks in Africa or in Britain, would there? An awful lot of them survive. And again, there's no point in arguing against globalization or Western civilization. They are all products of it. We are all products of it. The honest teaching of the British Empire is to say, quite simply, it is the first key stage of our globalization. It's probably the most important moment in human history and is still with us. The interview sparked a backlash, including from former Chancellor Sajid Javid, who said that Mr. Starkey's racist comments were a reminder of the appalling views that still exist. The appalling views that still exist. This is rather inelegant. Oh, Javid says we are the most successful multiracial democracy in the world. Oh, yeah. And let's see. Child sex slavery, widespread in Britain for decades, covered up by authorities at all levels. Is that what Sajid Javid would consider to be one of the attributes of the most successful multiracial democracy in the world? That woman who calls herself, Penny Black, Penny Dreadful, whatever, this prominent English feminist who's now a polyamorist. There was a well-known debate that she took part in with Starkey, where he pointed out that she was privileged and he was from a working class background, and he accused her of being a jumped up public school girl. Craig Brown asks, what is the world's bitchiest profession? Some would nominate hairdressers. Deary me, who cut this last? Other would argue journalists. However, recent events have convinced me that when it comes to cattiness, one profession beats all others hands down. I am talking of historians. Oddly enough, it is popularly regarded as a profession full of trusty Tweety characters steeped in wisdom. But beware, if you ever see a distinguished historian coming towards you, my advice is to dive into the nearest alley. Dr. David Starkey has long been seen as Britain's bitchiest historian. Cattiness is his calling card. One day he compares the Scottish National Party to the Nazi Party. The next he describes the Catholic Church as riddled with corruption. Is that controversial? It is riddled with corruption. A few years ago, he described his fellow historian Mary Beard as old and ugly. Paradoxically, he also complained that only pretty female historians were given their own TV shows. After each of these outbursts, other members of his profession turn on him, demanding his resignation. In 2011, after he attacked black culture on Newsnight, 102 of his fellow historians signed a letter condemning him. David Starkey reminds me of his predecessor as the terror of Tudor history, the late A.L. Rowse. Rouse's diaries are full of swipes against colleagues. He complains that neither Isaiah Berlin and John Sparrow, Warden of All Souls, has been able to produce a single book of any weight. He declares himself more intelligent than Hugh Trevor Roper, the Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford. He calls Sir Arthur Bryant second-rate, and even has it in for Bryant's dog, Jimmy. I have never liked that dog. Rejoicing when Jimmy bit Bryant's nose, turning it into a perfect pickle, all bloody. It was poetic justice. In 1994, the elderly Rowse was visited by yet another Tudor historian, Sir Roy Strong, who sniped in his diary that Rouse's suit was filthy and his chin covered with tufted stubble. 10 years earlier, Strong had invited the distinguished historian, Sir J.H. Plum, to dinner, noting that he was querulous and ill-tempered, and that he referred to Trevor Roper with venomous dislike. In 2001, Strong marked Plum's passing with something close to glee. He became bad-tempered and jealous in his last years. Isaiah Berlin called him an ignoble character. I think that Craig Brown is only half serious in complaining about this. I find it all delightful myself. It adds greatly to the gaiety of the nation, as the saying goes. That, oh yes, some men are saying unpleasant things about other men. Well, I never. And apparently these people would never suffer from, professional jealousy, right? Let's see. In August 2011, Starkey attracted widespread criticism for comments made on BBC's Newsnight, where he was a panel member together with Owen Jones, oh dear, and Dreda Say Mitchell. The program discussed the 2011 England riots. Yes, another outstanding example of multicultural democracy in which white people were set upon by the hundreds or thousands by blacks. And in many cases, it was demanded of them that they remove their clothing so that the black people could have them. Starkey condemned this language, which is wholly false, which is this Jamaican patois that's been intruded in England. And this is why so many of us have this sense of literally a foreign country. And furthermore, he attacked the proles. He said the whites have become black, a particular sort of violent, destructive, nihilistic gangster culture. Where's the lie? Where's the lie? Yes, David Starkey has been dropped by his publisher, HarperCollins, and another publisher, Hodder and Stoughton. Oh, they would never work with him again. Abhorrent. I wanted to finish by talking about Ellen DeGeneres. I woke up this morning and looked at what was trending on Twitter, and R.I.P. Ellen was trending. And I wondered about this. Apparently, there are a lot of people out there who do not like Ellen DeGeneres. And this fake meme was being pushed that she was dead, although some people say that it's referring to the possible cancellation of her television show. What these people were doing was they put R.I.P. Ellen and pictures of someone else who was blonde, but not Ellen DeGeneres. It's rather amusing, actually. Is Ellen dead or not? Y'all confusing TF out of me, R.I.P. Ellen, tweeted one distraught fan amid false reports. The 62-year-old comic and talk show host had jumped off the roof of a house. Other Twitterati mocked the late entertainer with fake obituaries featuring pics of DeGeneres' various celebrity doppelgangers. R.I.P. Ellen, fly high, Angle, tweeted one Twitter wit on a pic of Jane Lynch's character from Glee, and there was Justin Bieber, and there was Kathy Bates, there was Katy Perry. Needless to say, the Emmy-winning entertainer, isn't she also the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, I believe? She's been feeling the heat of late, with rumors swirling that her show is getting jettisoned amid falling ratings. I can tell you that I know that a lot of this stuff is being pushed by QAnon because they believe her to be guilty of something which I'm not going to mention here. In March, comedian Kevin T. Porter launched a viral Twitter thread calling for anyone who encountered DeGeneres to respond with insane stories about Ellen being mean. Apparently, some drag queen or some transsexual person was on Ellen DeGeneres' show and complained that he or she, I can't remember which, was not being fawned on sufficiently by Ellen. I hold no brief for Ellen DeGeneres, but I find this all very amusing indeed. A new staff member was told every day she picks someone different to really hate. It's not your fault. Just suck it up for the day, and she'll be mean to someone else the next day. They didn't believe it, but it ended up being entirely true, TV writer Ben Simon wrote in one response. Yes, and it's never been known that people who say do daily talk shows are ever characterized by anxiety or irritability. Most recently, crew members from the comedian show accused her of being rude to them during the coronavirus lockdown. I don't know, as far as intersectional points go, well, I mean, she's a lesbian, but on the other hand, she's white and a blonde. Is her name Greek in origin? Did I hear that somewhere? Let's see. She is of French, English, German, and Irish descent. Okay. No. So she's a blonde, white lesbian. And in these days of Black Lives Matter, that just doesn't cut it. It simply doesn't. Oh, finally, I'm going to comment on this, how would I put it, this lurid defamation suit that Johnny Depp is prosecuting against the Sun newspaper, the London Sun. I think he is also prosecuting a defamation case against his ex-wife, Amber Heard, who was popularly known as the most beautiful woman in the world, and she is quite beautiful. But I don't, even if this had happened to me, I don't know that I would want to say it in a courtroom in front of reporters. Johnny Depp today claimed that he decided to divorce Amber Heard after she defecated in their marital bed as a prank, as he denied hitting her and said that she had abused him throughout their marriage. The Hollywood legend, 57, is suing the Sun for labeling him a wife-beater, and today branded those accusations sick and completely untrue at a long-awaited blockbuster libel trial at the High Court in London. I've long thought that the tabloids say various things about various people, and most of them are forgotten by the next day. But if you make an effort, you spend months or years and spend millions of dollars and receive millions of words in coverage that you've been accused of being a wife beater, a great many people are going to believe that you are in fact a wife beater. I have a certain amount of sympathy for Johnny Depp, just as I have a certain amount of sympathy for Brad Pitt with regard to his woes with Angelina Jolie. But my sympathy reaches a very hard limit because in both cases I come to the same conclusion No one held a gun to your head and forced you to marry a crazy lesbian. So let's have a final look at the chat. People are talking about margaritas. Shot of... Oh, I see. I was talking about British historians and everyone tuned out. Could that be it? He looks like a heroin addict. Yes, if I had been his lawyer or just his friend, I would have advised him to get a haircut, to do something about his face, to get a different pair of glasses. Yeah. Meaty Head says, after making Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Depp went crazy. He called Hunter S. Thompson one of his heroes. Hunter S. Thompson was an appalling man, just absolutely appalling. His writing got much, much worse over time. His book on Hell's Angels, which is not written in Gonzo style, is really quite good. And Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, I found hilariously funny. But he lived for decades after that. Heck McNeck says, sorry, I missed the stream, Kevin. I was painting over a Black Lives Matter mural. Metal Mike says, Hunter S. Thompson was Epsteined after he started writing about 9/11. He committed suicide, didn't he? And he seems exactly like the sort of person who would commit suicide. I mean, he'd been seriously out of control for many years. Tom Wolfe knew him a little. They were both considered members of the New Journalism. I don't know what this is called, but there's a kind of a can that one opens. It's used by sailors, and I guess it's to indicate one's presence or if one is lost. And Wolfe was at a restaurant with Thompson, and he opened this up, and Wolfe said that it is impossible to describe just how loud this was. And of course, everyone else in the restaurant, and presumably Wolfe himself, thought that, death was imminent or the like. But that was kind of, I suppose that was the point of Thompson's practical jokes. You're telling me that black people in Britain are starting to dominate the white boys. Imagine my shock. Well, the whip hand, as Enoch Powell said it, from the same person, Jeep. I think that all ambitious people are aggressive, so it makes sense that Ellen is a bit mean. I'm not sure these traits are separable. I don't know. A lot of people are quite nervous before their shows. A lot of people are standoffish before their shows. This has been my experience with people I've known in the music business, that you really didn't want to be around them, before the show started. Jay Leno, on the other hand, he used to visit the green room and, shake hands with everyone and say hello to people who were going to be on his show. And many people have pointed out how touched they were by this, because it's not standard in the industry. Josh Randall says Hunter was perpetually saturated in intoxicants. Yes, Hauper says a kind of warped tribute to Hemingway, his last joke. Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think one reaches a point, at 30, 35, 40, where you really can't pull that stuff off anymore the way you could in your younger years. We're going to be talking about a famous outlaw on the book club on Friday. That is Jesse James. Ron Hansen's book, The Assassination of Jesse James, by the coward Robert Ford. And we're going to be talking about All That Jazz by Bob Fosse on Theater Thursday. Thank you for all tuning in. Hang on just one second. Thanks for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it as well if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so previously. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. If you like this show, I would greatly appreciate it as well if you could possibly contribute. My PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I will leave you with this: in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I dearly hope that all of you, my dear listeners and viewers, do manage to forge a genuine human connection of some kind in order to ease the burden. Good night.